Picture a small, rain-soaked island off the coast of Europe. Now imagine that same island controlling nearly a quarter of the Earth's land surface and ruling over 400 million people, roughly 23% of the world's population. This isn't science fiction. This is the story of the British Empire, the largest empire in human history. At its peak in 1920, the British Empire was so vast that the sun literally never set on British territory. Whilst you sipped morning tea in London, it was afternoon in India, evening in Australia, and still yesterday in parts of Canada. The phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," wasn't just propaganda, it was mathematical fact. But how did this happen? How did a small island nation, roughly the size of Michigan, come to dominate global trade, reshape continents, and influence the course of human history in ways we still feel today? The answer isn't simple. It's a tale spanning 5 centuries, filled with ambition and innovation, exploration and exploitation, triumph and tragedy. This is the complete story of the British Empire, from its humble beginnings in the age of wooden ships and canvas sails, through its zenith as the world's supreme superpower, to its surprisingly rapid dissolution in the 20th century. It's a history that shaped the modern world for better and worse, and one that continues to echo in our politics, our languages, and our global systems today. Let's begin at the beginning. The story of British imperialism doesn't begin with Britain at all. It begins with envy. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, sailing under the Spanish flag, stumbled upon the Americas. Just 6 years later, Portuguese navigator Vasco da Gama found a sea route to India around the Cape of Good Hope. Suddenly, the Iberian powers, Spain and Portugal, were flooding their treasuries with gold, silver, spices, and exotic goods from across the globe. In 1494, they'd even had the audacity to divide the entire non-European world between themselves in the Treaty of Tordesillas, with the Pope's blessing. England watched from the sidelines, a relatively minor European power still recovering from the Wars of the Roses. But envy breeds ambition. The first tentative English steps toward empire came under King Henry VII. In 1497, he commissioned Italian explorer John Cabot to search for a northwest passage to Asia. Cabot reached Newfoundland instead, giving England its first claim to North American territory. But it would be decades before England seriously pursued this claim. The real catalyst was religious upheaval. When Henry VIII broke with Rome in 1534, establishing the Church of England, he set Britain on a collision course with Catholic Spain and Portugal. Protestantism became intertwined with national identity, and challenging Catholic dominance overseas became a commercial and religious mission. Under Queen Elizabeth I, 1558 to 1603, England transformed from cautious observer to aggressive competitor. Elizabeth authorized sea dogs, essentially state-sponsored pirates like Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh, to raid Spanish treasure ships and colonies. When Drake circumnavigated the globe between 1577 and 1580, plundering Spanish ports along the way, he returned home a hero. Elizabeth knighted him aboard his ship, the Golden Hind. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 was the turning point. Spain had sent 130 ships to invade England and restore Catholic rule. The English navy, aided by terrible weather, destroyed them. The victory didn't just save Protestant England, it shattered the myth of Spanish invincibility and opened the seas to English ambition. The age of the British Empire was about to begin. The story of British imperialism doesn't begin with Britain at all. It begins with envy. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, sailing under the Spanish flag, stumbled upon the Americas. Just 6 years later, Portuguese navigator Vasco da Gama found a sea route to India around the Cape of Good Hope. Suddenly, the Iberian powers, Spain and Portugal, were flooding their treasuries with gold, silver, spices, and exotic goods from across the globe. In 1494, they'd even had the audacity to divide the entire non-European world between themselves in the Treaty of Tordesillas, with the Pope's blessing. England watched from the sidelines, a relatively minor European power still recovering from the Wars of the Roses. But envy breeds ambition. The first tentative English steps toward empire came under King Henry VII. In 1497, he commissioned Italian explorer John Cabot to search for a northwest passage to Asia. Cabot reached Newfoundland instead, giving England its first claim to North American territory. But it would be decades before England seriously pursued this claim. The real catalyst was religious upheaval. When Henry VIII broke with Rome in 1534, establishing the Church of England, he set Britain on a collision course with Catholic Spain and Portugal. Protestantism became intertwined with national identity, and challenging Catholic dominance overseas became both a commercial and religious mission. Under Queen Elizabeth I, 1558 to 1603, England transformed from cautious observer to aggressive competitor. Elizabeth authorized sea dogs, essentially state-sponsored pirates like Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh, to raid Spanish treasure ships and colonies. When Drake circumnavigated the globe between 1570 and 1580, plundering Spanish ports along the way, he returned home a hero. Elizabeth knighted him aboard his ship, the Golden Hind. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 was the turning point. Spain had sent 130 ships to invade England and restore Catholic rule. The English Navy, aided by terrible weather, destroyed them. The victory didn't just save Protestant England, it shattered the myth of Spanish invincibility and opened the seas to English ambition. The age of the British Empire was about to begin. The birth of corporate colonialism. On December 31, 1600, Queen Elizabeth I granted a royal charter to the Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies, better known as the East India Company. This wasn't a government agency, it was a private corporation of investors seeking profit. Yet this company would eventually conquer an entire subcontinent. The East India Company established its first factory, trading post, in Surat, India in 1612. Initially, the company was simply a merchant operation, trading English wool and silver for Indian cotton, silk, indigo, and saltpeter. But the Mughal Empire controlled India, and the English were just one of many foreign traders competing with the Portuguese, Dutch, and French. The Caribbean and North America. Whilst the East India Company focused on Asia, English adventurers turned westward. The first permanent English settlement in North America was established at Jamestown, Virginia, in 1607. It nearly failed. Of the original 104 settlers, only 38 survived. They were saved by tobacco. John Rolfe's cultivation of tobacco created England's first profitable American export, though it required one troubling ingredient: massive amounts of labor. The Caribbean islands became England's most valuable early possessions. Barbados, claimed in 1625, became a sugar powerhouse. Jamaica, captured from Spain in 1655, followed suit. These islands generated enormous wealth, but at a horrific human cost. The indigenous populations were decimated, and the labor-intensive sugar plantations became the engine of the Atlantic slave trade. Between 1640 and 1807, British merchants transported approximately 3.1 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic, more than any other nation. Cities like Bristol, Liverpool, and London grew wealthy on this triangular trade: manufactured goods to Africa, enslaved people to the Americas, sugar and tobacco back to Britain. The moral stain of this trade would haunt British history for centuries. The Anglo-Dutch Wars and the rise of naval power. Britain's main 17th-century rival wasn't Spain, it was the Netherlands. The Dutch had built a commercial empire based on trade rather than territorial conquest, and their merchant fleet was the world's largest. In 1652 to 1674, England and the Netherlands fought 3 wars for commercial supremacy. The English lost some battles, but learned valuable lessons in naval warfare. More importantly, they captured New Amsterdam in 1664, renaming it New York. The Anglo-Dutch rivalry ended when Dutchman William of Orange became King of England in 1688, uniting the two powers against their common enemy, France. The battle for North America and India. The 18th century was defined by the struggle between Britain and France for global dominance. They fought each other in Europe, North America, the Caribbean, and India, often simultaneously. In North America, British and French colonists competed for territory and the lucrative fur trade. The 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War in America, was truly the first global conflict. British forces, led by generals like James Wolfe, ultimately triumphed. The Treaty of Paris, signed in September 3, 1763, gave Britain control of Canada and all French territory east of the Mississippi River. But the real prize was India. The conquest of Bengal. By the 1750s, the Mughal Empire was fragmenting into rival kingdoms. Both the British East India Company and the French Compagnie des Indes sought to exploit this chaos, each backing different Indian rulers. The decisive moment came on June 23, 1757, at the Battle of Plassey in Bengal. Robert Clive, commanding about 3,000 troops, mostly Indian sepoys, faced the Nawab of Bengal's army of 50,000. Through a combination of superior artillery, tactical brilliance, and treachery, Clive had bribed the Nawab's commander, Mir Jafar, to betray his master. The British won a stunning victory. Plassey wasn't just a battle, it was a corporate takeover. The East India Company now controlled Bengal, the richest province in India. Company officials plundered the treasury, and Clive himself took £234,000, equivalent to roughly £300 million today. When questioned in Parliament about his conduct, Clive famously declared, "I stand astonished at my moderation." The Battle of Plassey marked the beginning of British rule in India, a rule that would last 190 years. The loss of America. By 1770, Britain stood supreme. It had defeated France, controlled much of North America, dominated India, and ruled the seas. The first British Empire was at its zenith. But empires, like all human creations, contain the seeds of their own destruction. Britain's American colonies had grown prosperous and self-reliant. When Britain tried to tax them to pay for their own defense through measures like the Stamp Act of 1765 and the Tea Act of 1773, the colonists rebelled. No taxation without representation became their rallying cry. On July 4, 1776, 13 colonies declared independence. Britain sent armies to crush the rebellion, confident of victory. Instead, aided by France, Spain, and the Netherlands, all eager to wound Britain, the colonists won. General Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown on October 19, 1781. The Treaty of Paris, signed on September 3, 1783, recognized American independence. Britain had lost its most populous and economically valuable colonies. Many predicted the end of the British Empire. They were spectacularly wrong. The pivot to the East. The loss of America forced a strategic rethink. British attention turned decisively toward Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. As historian Vincent Harlow observed, this wasn't just geographical substitution. It was a new kind of empire, based on trade dominance and naval supremacy rather than settlement colonies. The French Revolution in 1789 and the subsequent rise of Napoleon Bonaparte plunged Europe into 2 decades of war. Britain stood as the primary opponent of French expansion, funding coalition after coalition against Napoleon. The Royal Navy became Britain's supreme weapon. Admiral Horatio Nelson's victory at the Battle of Trafalgar on October 21, 1805, destroyed the combined French and Spanish fleets, ensuring British naval supremacy for the next century. Nelson died in the battle, his last words reportedly being, "Thank God I have done my duty." When Napoleon was finally defeated at Waterloo on June 18, 1815, Britain emerged as the world's preeminent power. The peace settlement gave Britain strategic territories across the globe: Cape Colony in South Africa, Ceylon, Sri Lanka, Mauritius, and Trinidad, amongst others. The Industrial Revolution and global dominance. Britain's imperial expansion coincided with and was fueled by the Industrial Revolution. Britain was the first nation to industrialize, giving it an overwhelming economic and military advantages. Steam-powered ships could traverse oceans regardless of wind patterns. Railways could penetrate continents. Telegraph cables could transmit messages across the world in minutes. Mechanized textile factories could produce cloth cheaper than Indian hand weavers. Breech-loading rifles and Maxim guns could mow down any army still relying on muskets and swords. These technological advantages enabled a tiny number of British administrators and soldiers to control vast territories. In 1857, just 40,000 British troops, alongside about 200,000 Indian sepoys, controlled a subcontinent of 300 million people. The Indian Rebellion and the Raj. The East India Company's rule in India was extractive and often brutal. Company officials grew fabulously wealthy, whilst Indian industries were destroyed to benefit British manufactures. Taxes were crushing. Traditional rulers were deposed or reduced to puppets. On May 10, 1857, Indian soldiers, sepoys in Meerut, mutinied against their British officers. The spark was rumors that new rifle cartridges were greased with beef and pork fat, offensive to both Hindu and Muslim soldiers who had to bite them open. But the underlying causes were decades of resentment. The rebellion spread rapidly across northern India. British civilians were massacred at Kanpur. The siege of Lucknow became legendary. Rebel forces proclaimed the restoration of Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar. The British response was savage. Entire villages were burned. Suspected rebels were blown from cannons. The rebellion was crushed by 1858, but it had shaken British confidence. The East India Company was abolished. On November 1, 1858, Queen Victoria assumed direct rule over India. The British Raj, the jewel in the imperial crown, had begun. The scramble for Africa. Until the 1880s, European control of Africa was limited to coastal trading posts. The interior remained unmapped and unconquered, at least by Europeans. This changed with shocking speed. Between 1881 and 1914, European powers carved up virtually the entire continent. Britain claimed the lion's share. Cecil Rhodes, the diamond magnate and imperialist visionary, dreamed of British territory stretching from Cape to Cairo, a continuous band of red on the map. Though never fully realized, Rhodes' vision drove British expansion through southern and eastern Africa. Britain annexed Egypt in 1882 to protect the Suez Canal, completed in 1869, and vital for maintaining quick access to India. General Kitchener conquered Sudan in 1898, avenging the death of General Gordon at Khartoum 13 years earlier. Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, and vast swathes of West, East, and Southern Africa became British territories. The Second Boer War in 1900 to 1902 in South Africa was particularly brutal. British forces fought Dutch-descended settlers, Boers, for control of gold and diamond-rich territories. To break Boer resistance, the British invented concentration camps, where 26,000 Boer women and children died of disease and neglect, a dark chapter that foreshadowed 20th century atrocities. The height of empire. By 1900, the British Empire encompassed 11 million square miles and 400 million people. British culture, language, law, and institutions spread across the globe. English became the language of international commerce. British-built railways crisscrossed India, Africa, and Australia. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. This was Pax Britannica, British peace. The Royal Navy patrolled the seas, suppressing piracy and the slave trade, which Britain had abolished in 1807. British merchants dominated global trade. British banks financed development worldwide. But this peace came at enormous cost to subject peoples. Famines in India, caused partly by British policies, killed millions. Indigenous peoples in Australia and North America were dispossessed and decimated. Resources were extracted to fuel British industry, whilst local economies were restructured to serve imperial needs. The White Dominions. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa developed differently from other colonies. These White Dominions, populated primarily by British settlers, gradually gained self-governance whilst remaining within the empire. The British North America Act of 1867 created the Dominion of Canada. Australia federated in 1901. New Zealand gained Dominion status in 1907. South Africa followed in 1910. These dominions controlled their own domestic affairs, but deferred to London on foreign policy and defense. This model allowed Britain to maintain global influence through willing partners rather than coercion, at least with its white settler colonies. Cracks in the foundation. Yet even at its peak, the empire showed signs of strain. The Second Boer War revealed military incompetence and required 450,000 troops to defeat 88,000 Boer fighters. Germany and the United States were rapidly industrializing, challenging British economic supremacy. Nationalist movements stirred in Ireland, India, and Egypt. In 1905, Japan, a non-European power that had rapidly modernized, defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, demonstrating that Western military dominance wasn't inevitable. Britain, recognizing reality, allied with Japan. The seeds of empire's end were already germinating. The Great War. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, few predicted global catastrophe, but a web of alliances dragged Europe into war. Britain entered on August 4, 1914, after Germany invaded neutral Belgium. This wasn't just a European war, it was an imperial war. Britain mobilized its empire. Over 2.5 million soldiers from India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and other colonies served. Indian soldiers fought in France and Mesopotamia. Anzac troops suffered horrific casualties at Gallipoli. Canadian forces distinguished themselves at Vimy Ridge. The war strained the empire to breaking point. Defense costs skyrocketed. Britain accumulated massive debts to the United States. Over 880,000 soldiers from Britain and its empire died. An entire generation of young men lost. The war also planted seeds of future independence movements. Colonial soldiers had fought and died for the empire, yet returned home to the same racial discrimination and lack of political rights. In India, the British government had promised post-war reforms in exchange for support. When the Amritsar massacre occurred on April 13, 1919, British troops killed 379 unarmed Indian protesters. Trust shattered. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 paradoxically expanded the empire. Britain received German colonies in Africa and Ottoman territories in the Middle East as League of Nations mandates, theoretically temporary administrations, but effectively new colonies. Palestine, Transjordan, Iraq, and former German East Africa came under British control. By 1920, the British Empire reached its maximum territorial extent, 13.7 million square miles, nearly a quarter of Earth's land surface. But this was a hollow victory. Britain was exhausted, indebted, and facing rising nationalism in its colonies. The dismantling begins. Britain emerged from World War II victorious but broken. The new Labour government, elected in 1945, faced impossible choices: rebuild Britain or maintain the empire. They couldn't afford both. The empire's end came with shocking speed, a process that would have seemed unthinkable just decades earlier. India was the empire's jewel, its largest, richest, and most populous possession. But nationalist movements, led by Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru of the Indian National Congress and Muhammad Ali Jinnah of the Muslim League, had made British rule untenable. Lord Mountbatten, the last viceroy, was given an impossible task: grant independence and leave. The process was rushed and chaotic. Religious tensions between Hindus and Muslims exploded into violence. Mountbatten moved the independent state forward to August 15, 1947. India was partitioned into Hindu-majority India and Muslim-majority Pakistan. The border was drawn hastily by a British lawyer who'd never been to India, Cyril Radcliffe, using outdated maps. The result was catastrophe. Between 10 and 20 million people fled across new borders. Conservative estimates suggest 1 million died in communal violence. Trains arrived at stations filled with massacred passengers. Gandhi himself was assassinated in 1948 by a Hindu extremist who thought him too sympathetic to Muslims. The jewel in the crown had departed, covered in blood. Independence spread like wildfire. Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and Burma gained independence in 1948. Palestine, which Britain had promised to both Jews and Arabs, descended into civil war. Britain, unable to find a solution, simply left in 1948, leaving Jews and Arabs to fight it out. The State of Israel was declared, leading to the First Arab-Israeli War. The 1950s saw African colonies begin demanding independence. Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African colony to gain independence in 1957, led by Kwame Nkrumah. Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister, acknowledged reality in his famous 1960 Wind of Change speech delivered in South Africa. The wind of change is blowing through this continent, and whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact. By the mid-1960s, the floodgates were open. Nigeria, 1960, Tanzania, 1961, Uganda, 1962, Kenya, 1963, Zambia, 1964, and many others gained independence. Most transitions were peaceful, but some involved brutal conflicts, particularly Kenya, where the Mau Mau Rebellion 1952 to 1960 saw the British establish detention camps where torture and killings occurred. The Suez Crisis, the death of illusion. If any single event marked the end of Britain as a great power, it was the Suez Crisis of 1956. When Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain and France, with Israeli cooperation, launched a military operation to seize it back. The operation succeeded militarily, but failed politically. The United States, angry at not being consulted, refused to support Britain. The Soviet Union threatened intervention. Under American economic pressure, particularly threats to the pound, Britain was forced to withdraw in humiliation. The message was clear. Britain could no longer act as a great power without American approval. The age of British dominance was over. The final chapters. Through the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, the empire continued to shrink. Most Caribbean colonies gained independence. Pacific islands became independent nations. Rhodesia's white minority government unilaterally declared independence in 1965 rather than accept majority rule, leading to a civil war that ended only in 1980 with the creation of Zimbabwe. The handover of Hong Kong to China on July 1, 1997, symbolized the end. Hong Kong had been British since 1842. Its return was negotiated by Margaret Thatcher and Deng Xiaoping, with Britain having little leverage. Prince Charles attended the ceremony as the Union Jack was lowered for the last time over this last significant colonial possession. The British Empire was over. What remains? Today, 14 overseas territories remain under British sovereignty, tiny remnants like Gibraltar, the Falklands, and Bermuda. The sun technically still doesn't set on British territory, thanks to the Pitcairn Islands in the Pacific, but the empire's legacy extends far beyond these scraps. English is the global lingua franca, spoken by 1.5 billion people. Parliamentary democracy, common law legal systems, and Westminster-style governance persist in former colonies. The Commonwealth of Nations, comprising 56 independent states, most former British colonies, continues as a voluntary association. 15 Commonwealth realms still recognize the British monarch, currently King Charles III, as their head of state. The Empire's legacy, the contested legacy. The Empire's legacy remains deeply controversial. Supporters point to infrastructure development, the spread of democracy, the abolition of practices like sati in India, and institutions that enabled post-colonial development. British rule, they argue, brought stability, education, and economic development. Critics counter with the human cost, tens of millions dead in famines, particularly in India and Ireland, resources extracted to enrich Britain whilst impoverishing colonies, cultures suppressed, indigenous peoples displaced or destroyed, and arbitrary borders drawn that fuel conflicts to this day. The Atlantic slave trade alone represents an unfathomable moral crime. Perhaps both are true. Empires are complex, containing simultaneously genuine achievements and terrible crimes. The British Empire modernized much of the world, but primarily for British benefit. It spread democratic ideals whilst denying democracy to subject peoples. It built infrastructure to extract resources more efficiently. Lessons and reflections. The rise and fall of the British Empire offers profound lessons. It demonstrates that no dominance lasts forever. It shows how technological superiority can enable a small nation to control vast territories, but only temporarily. It reveals how economic pressures and moral contradictions eventually undermine even the mightiest powers. For Britain today, the empire casts a long shadow. Brexit debates referenced imperial nostalgia. Britain still struggles with its multicultural identity, shaped by immigration from former colonies. The question of what Britain's role should be in a world it no longer dominates remains unresolved. The British Empire shaped our modern world, from the global dominance of English to the borders of dozens of nations to international institutions and global trade patterns. Understanding its history isn't about judging our ancestors. It's about understanding how we arrived at our present moment and what lessons that journey might teach us about power, responsibility, and the inevitable arc of all human endeavors. The sun has set on the British Empire, but its legacy, for better and worse, endures.